Hey, good evening. We're glad that you are joining us again tonight. We are picking up on our study from Nehemiah chapter 5 this week. We have hit up three chapters already. We skipped one, Nehemiah chapter 3. And so we're going to move on. Shouldn't have, according to Chad, but we don't get to listen to what he says every week. We do our own thing sometimes. Ain't that right, Blaine? So, chapter 5 this week, we start talking a little bit more about some of the struggles that they were having as they were rebuilding the wall. By the time we get to chapter 6, we see the wall's complete in a pretty short amount of time. Last week, we talked a lot about external opposition and the fear that was on the people, even entitled it a shovel and a sword and a trowel, I think, because of the opposition they were facing. And so this week, as we start Nehemiah, I'll get it right in a second. Nehemiah chapter 5, we see some of the other opposition that they face. Blaine, you want to read some of that for us? A few verses, maybe?
Yeah, I'll go 1 through 6 or so.
Sure.
Now there arose a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers. For there were those who said, With our sons and our daughters we are many, so let us get grain, that we may eat and keep alive. There were also those who said, We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, our houses to get grain because of the famine. And there were those who said, We have borrowed money for the king's taxes on our fields and our vineyards. Now our flesh is as the flesh of our brothers, and our children are as their children. Yet we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but it is not in our power to help it, for other men have our fields and our vineyards.
All right. So I think, Chad, you've got some thoughts on the borrowing concept of the time.
Yeah, so, well, let me back up a little bit. We talked about opposition from the outside last week. And again, we're, you know, several thousand years removed from what happens here. And so whenever we read about, like in verse 1, there's this great outcry of people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers. Well, I mean, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us because most of us are not Jewish. But if we read that, like, now you got some church members who are crying out against other church members, I think it gets us a little bit more closer to home. And if you say something like, well, we got church members who are crying out because they're on one side of this issue, and then we got other church members who are upset because they're on the other side of this issue. I want to start at 9 o'clock. You want to start at 10 o'clock, something like that. Then I think it really starts to bring into focus these people have real issues, and a lot bigger issues, as we'll see, than worship start times. So they got these folks who have given up their trades. They were perfumers and they're not creating perfume anymore. They were farmers and not really farming anymore. They've stopped all that work to go build the wall. And as they've started building this wall, they've incurred debts. And so, I'm thinking like in verse 3. There are also those who said, We are mortgaging our fields and vineyards and houses to get grain because of this famine. Okay, um, that's okay. But what we're going to find out is happening is these guys are um, giving out loans to their fellow brothers and sisters, and they're charging them interest. And in our world, it doesn't seem like a huge deal to us, but their law, forbid them from doing that. They weren't supposed to be charging any interest, especially to their own flesh and blood, their Jewish brothers and sisters. So, um, loaning in the ancient world was actually a good thing. It was to help your neighbor, to help serve your neighbor, to do good to somebody was to give them a loan and not charge them anything in return. That's not what's happening here. They got some real problems. Um, and we're going to, I guess, lead into this. I can go ahead and jump in, I guess. And it leads to them um, getting their sons and their daughters into a servant relationship. The word translated a lot of times as slave, but it's not really slave. It's you were not able to pay the debt, and so you signed your son or your daughter up for 5 or 6 years of indentured servitude. Whenever that debt is paid off, they're just returned right back to you they always were yours. They were never owned as property or anything like that in the ancient world. It was just, you have a debt, you can't pay the debt. You have a son, he goes and works to pay off that debt. It's kind of like getting a job today, maybe. And it makes sense for the children to go do it because, well, they're, not expendable, but, if mom and dad are still working at the house and they can get the house in order, and the family can be set up for a much better future in 5 or 6 years. And so it's actually not, it looks terrible and sounds terrible on the surface, but I'm not convinced it's as bad as we typically think that it is. What do y'all think?
Right off the bat, we see this division, and it gets me thinking about Matthew 12:25. It says, "Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and no city or house divided against itself will stand." In context here, the Pharisees were saying Jesus was casting out demons in the name of Beelzebub, but I think that that concept kind of transcends that moment, and it applies to the whole kingdom of God and all the people that are working in it. So, like when God's people are fighting one another, they're not getting God's work done, and they're not fighting that enemy. And we kind of see that this house is divided against itself, because of greed. It comes down to that. Chad already kind of hit on, what all was happening. But, this problem was found in their hearts. The rich were getting richer at the expense of the poor. And, as God's people, there's no reason for, a brother or sister to have to take out a loan to get the basic necessities of life for themselves and for their families, especially when there's others that, have the means to provide for them.
Yeah, I think, Jesus said, somebody comes to you needing food and you have an abundance, give it. Somebody comes to you needing a coat and you have two, give them one. I think where we fall on this is that God's people are supposed to take better care of each other than we expect from the world. I think we see Jesus say that and teach that several different ways. One of how we lend money to each other. One is how we take care of each other. But throughout all this, there was an expectation that God's people treat each other better than the world and those outside treat them. I think there's a couple reasons for that. The big reason I think in this particular instance that this is a big issue is because we're all supposed to be in this together. And we're all supposed to be trying to take back Jerusalem. We're all supposed to be working to rebuild this wall. We're all supposed to be trying to get to security and a place of being an established nation again. And some people just weren't doing that. And so there's a call to be better. There's a call to treat each other better than we expect the world to treat us. Jesus says it like, what good does it do you? Don't lend expecting to receive something back in return. Lend to do good to others. I think something Chad and I talked about before this recording, but I think every time that we see greed and we see an injustice, God's people are expected to react to that injustice, react to that greed in some way. I think Nehemiah could have easily sat back and focused only on the wall, but at the end of the day, this was going to be an issue that was going to continue to plague Jerusalem. So he had to do something. 1 Peter 3:11 says to seek peace and pursue it. And I think it's in that pursuit of that we see Nehemiah act. We see him go out and do something to bring about peace. This is the same change message that we see throughout Scripture. Zacchaeus, we've already talked about Zacchaeus in one of these recordings. We've been recording for a long time now. I don't even know what week we're on, but Zacchaeus was, the wee little man. And that was Blaine's notes. That was all he made that day. And but Zacchaeus came out and he said, man, I've been messing these people over all this time. I'm going to repay it. When we get into it, that's what Nehemiah does to these Jewish brethren. Is he says, y'all have really been messing this up. I'm going to go get the preacher and let the priest hear you say, all right, I'm going to fix this. That way you're held accountable. So, Chad, the next time somebody goes and gets you and says, hey, come with me, I need you to witness somebody's promise to God to take care of something, you'll know it's because of this very lesson. But Nehemiah took a stand, and I think that's important to notice. Any other thoughts about these few verses? All right, go for it.
So I think this really hits at the whole focus of Scripture, especially up until this point in the Bible, is they've been brought out of Egypt into a land. They've lost that land. They've gone and been captive, and now they've been brought back. And the whole reason that they keep falling into these problems is they don't do what they're supposed to do. Their call is to go be God's chosen nation, go be God's chosen people, shine as lights into the darkness, be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And they're just not doing it. And so even like, in verse 5, our flesh is the flesh of our brothers, the brothers who were, selling them or taking their kids captive. Our children are as their children, but we're forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves. Some of our daughters are already enslaved, and we just can't help it. For other men have our fields and our vineyards. Those aren't outsiders. Those are Jewish folks who are taking other Jewish folks prisoners. They got a long history of being prisoners, but it's been at the hands of the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Now it's at the hands of the Jews. And so Nehemiah, rightly so, jumping ahead at verse 6, he's very angry, and he hears the outcry and these words. And the whole point is you're supposed to be lights to the world, and you're looking just as dark as everybody else. At this point, maybe even darker. And so what does that say about you? What's that say about the God that you're supposed to serve? If somebody looks out and says, man, look at how they treat one another, those God's people over there. I can't believe that. Why would I ever want to be a part of that group? And if we're not careful, my suspicion is that the world can look at the church and say the same thing. They're fighting about what? And they got these disagreements. Why would I ever want to be a part of that group? They can't even, much less fight the battle of opposition from the outside. They can't even get along with one another. What's that say about us? What's that say about how we love one another and how we care for one another and how we treat one another? That's what Nehemiah is angry about. I will say too, and then I'll shut up about the rest of this chapter and tackle it next week. When he says, I was very angry when I heard their outcry in those words, it's real easy for us to say, see, look, it's okay for me to be mad at everybody because I didn't get my way. Is that what Nehemiah's really doing here? No, he's saying, look, I'm angry and I'm upset and I'm crying out because you're not doing right, because God told us to live in this certain way. He told us to get along. He told us to be the light of the world. We're not doing it. The very folks who are supposed to relieve oppression are oppressing other folks by doing these crazy things. And Nehemiah says, I'm upset about it. And so a little bit of righteous indignation is good whenever God's will and God's purpose is being violated, not whenever I don't get my way. I'll kind of leave it at that.
Okay. So I guess, just jumping down to my big takeaway, we see here that, a famine and financial struggle stopped the work of God by causing division among his people. So today, we have this pandemic going on, and, that might be doing the same thing. We see a lot of division on, Facebook and in the media, about mask and returning to school and how serious the virus is and everything. But, if we're some of those people that are being argumentative, about everything that's going on, it may be time for us to, take a step back and ask ourselves if these disagreements and the division they're calling is keeping us from doing the work of God. If it is, I think we need to be encouraged by how the nobles, as Nehemiah referred to them, handled it. They stopped what they were doing, they made things right, and they got back to work on the wall, doing God's work. So I think that's something that sticks out to me for the day.
So if I'm going to wrap it up, right? Okay. We're choosing to end around midway part of chapter 5, and I'm going to skip ahead to the end of chapter 6. not on purpose to like ruin everything, but I think we all know that this wall gets built. And one of the points that I want to make on next week's video is that that was done because of God, and the people around them noticed that it was done because of God. And so to echo kind of what Chad was saying, people were already, their neighbors were already paying attention to what they were doing. Their neighbors were already seeing the work that God was doing in Jerusalem by building this wall. That's why we see them try so hard in the last chapter and then even in the next chapter to destroy that work and to slow that progress. The shame comes when we as Christians, or they as God's people in Jerusalem, don't treat each other like God's people. There should be a mutual respect for each other. I've used the phrase, we're going to have to give a lot of grace, more so than I ever thought that I would use during this last several months. Because the truth is, we don't know what we're doing. We don't know what's coming next. And everybody is seeming to just try to get by the best that they know how, make the best decisions that they can make. And if, as God's people, we do not treat each other with the highest level of respect, if we don't give to those that are in need, if we don't love one another the way that Christ asked us to love one another, which was, by the way, the same way that he loved us, by being self-sacrificing, seeking others' interest above our own, lowering ourselves, humility, then the neighbors that are watching are going to have nothing to do with us. So maybe it's that we, in the next several months, as we decide what does school look like, as we decide what do we do with our kids, what do we do at work, what do we do with these unpopular opinions, maybe it's that as Christians we need to give each other more grace, we need to show the greatest amount of love, and we need to seek the interest of others above ourselves so that our neighbors see that and they want to know what it is that we've got. That was how the first church spread. In the face of persecution, they spread because they grew because I want to be and be a part of what they've got. We got to show them that. That's all I've got. Is that all y'all got?
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock this Sunday.
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock. So one service, 10 a.m. That means that drive-through will still be occurring, but at 10 o'clock. So the drive-in church will still be happening in the Nash Dental parking lot across the street at 10 a.m. One service, 10 o'clock. This time, if you forget and show up at 9, you can sit around with the rest of us that will be here at 9. So we'll see you Sunday at 10. Have a good night.